I was a nerd when I was a kid. I used to use Telnet to hack into the University of Utah to connect to people that were in Sydney, Australia, actually, way back when the internet was brand new. So when hackers came out and they're like, don't do hacking, I'm like, why not? So building accessible careers. This is a little bit of a deviation from my standard accessibility talk. So we're going to start with this. It's a little bit of a kick. So imagine you're in a job interview and they tell you, I'm sorry, we can't even interview you because our system requires a phone screen, but you're deaf, and we don't really know how to handle like any of those deaf systems that you use for phones. So, and then you're on the phone a lot, like talking to people. So we can't hire you. And while you're thinking about that, as you saw before, my name is Jen Luker, and because this talk comes with a kick, I do have a disclaimer. It's mine. So accessibility. People have always wondered what the A11Y stands for, and the 11 characters, or the 11 letters in between A and Y, are what make up the 11 in A11Y. The same goes for internationalization, I18N, or Kubernetes, K8S. There's that many letters in between the first and last letter. And the reason this came about was because of Twitter. When you had only 140 characters, you had to keep things very succinct. And you couldn't spend 20 characters on a word like internationalization. So that's a little bit about where that came from. So what is accessibility? And accessibility is people with disabilities can perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with websites and tools, and they can contribute equally without barriers. So when we're talking about going to a job and you're in a wheelchair or you have crutches, the ability to get there is an accessibility concern. The ability to talk to people, to answer a phone when you're waiting for job interviews is an accessibility concern. The ability to learn through the ways that many of us do, through Stack Overflow, or through dev docs, are all accessibility concerns. And so is purchasing. So what is a disability? When a person is denied access due to a technology barrier, the impairment to their ability did not occur because of the body's limitations, rather the defect occurred in the technology. So when someone can't do something, it's not because of the limitation in their body, it's because we've not developed the technology to make it possible. It's not the person's fault, it's the technology's fault. We have elevators, we have screen readers, we have keyboards, we have ramps, we have Braille. And when we talk about diversity, oftentimes we think about the permanent disabilities, deafness, blindness, missing a limb, in a wheelchair. But there's also temporary impairments, like breaking an arm, having your eyes dilated, an eardrum burst because you were sick. And then there's situational limitations, like trying to watch a video in a really noisy place like a bar or a family reunion, or the mice for Apple has the plug at the bottom, so you can't exactly charge and use. These are all situational disabilities, situational impairments. And though you may have heard of those three a lot, there's others that people don't often talk about or don't often consider. For instance, age-related impairments. These things happen slowly over time. People have been able to see things just fine, but they're starting to squint. They're starting to need reading glasses. Or they're not able to move around quite as quickly as they used to. Climbing stairs is getting harder. There's also age-related impairments, as in they can't reach a shelf because they're 3. It goes both directions. Maybe they don't have the mental capacity at this point to be able to understand something. Maybe they can't read yet. Maybe they're from a different country. Multiple disabilities. Not everyone has just one disability. Just because you are in a wheelchair does not mean you cannot be blind as well, or deaf. Just because you have anxiety doesn't mean you can't also be suffering from OCD. So trying to adapt our technology to handle not just one disability, but combinations of disabilities can get really complex. There's also health conditions like pregnancy. These things will resolve themselves in 9 months, but it makes it really hard to drive or move near the end there. There's a fair amount of illness that tends to happen in the beginning. When I was pregnant and working as a dev, I pair-programmed with someone, and I did most of the high-level strategy, and my pair did a lot of the actual coding, because I could run off to the bathroom whenever I needed to and come back and still be a productive member of the team. Sometimes it's not the technology, but the process that needs to adapt. And then there's changing abilities, like my daughter, who has a neurological condition where some days she's perfectly fine, and other days she's in so much pain she can barely move. And when she does, it's to pass out or vomit. People have good days, people have bad days. Just because they're having a bad day today does not mean they can't have a good day tomorrow. And just because they could walk yesterday doesn't mean that wheelchair isn't necessary today. So when we're looking at numbers, we're talking about 61 million adults in the USA alone. 26% of adults, 1 in 4. That doesn't even include the children. And adults without disabilities that are caring for those children, or adults with disabilities that are caring for those children with disabilities as well. That's a lot of people. Jennifer Van had this amazing quote at React Rally a few years ago. I would say like 90% of your day is dictated by technology. And if you, as a person, are not included in that technology, what's the point if the app is fast? If you cannot even use it, what else matters? That the code is clean? That it's open source? That it's fast? That it loads very quickly? That the build size or bundle size is small? Doesn't matter if it doesn't work. If someone was unable to get through the purchase process, you'd be hotfixing that so fast heads would spin. So why is it different when someone with a disability can't get through the purchase process? Why is it a bug when you can't go through the purchase process, but it's a feature when someone who's colorblind can? Part of the problem I feel around accessibility is that the industry itself is so focused on accessibility being extra features on top of things. Or, yeah, but this way is faster. We'll get to it when we get to it. When we get big enough, when we have enough people that are actually looking at our websites. When we have enough people that are buying things, or it doesn't really apply to me because I sell rainbows and blind people don't really buy rainbows because they can't see them. But last I checked, blind people had families and not all of them are blind. Maybe they're buying their niece a rainbow. Maybe their uncle. And I want to go back a few slides and look at this number again. 26% of adults. Do you know how many websites are accessible? Less than 1 in 10. That means that if your website is accessible, you could corner the market. That's 26% of the population you could potentially reach that others can't. Not only that, but when you make websites accessible, you're improving the process for everyone. Like the person sitting in a bar using subtitles. They're not usually deaf, but in this situation, they're helpful. Or maybe the baby's sleeping. Or maybe you're tired of that thing where the explosions are so loud they're deafening, but the volume of the speech is so quiet, you're constantly like, up and downing this volume trying to make it function. Like sometimes subtitles are just nice. So not only are you making this process easier and the flow easier for people with accessibilities, but you're also making it easier for everybody else, which means they're more likely to make it through your flow process because they're not getting annoyed either. So not only are you cornering a market, but you're making it easier for everyone. And I don't know about you, but when it comes time for, repeat purchases, I go back to the site that was easy. The one where I didn't have to jump through a bunch of hoops. The one that made sense, that explained things when I needed it, that I could tab through really fast to the parts that I wanted, or use my arrow keys to skip entire rows. And if you're thinking for a moment, throwing out numbers, that you have like a $10 million company and you access this 26%, if you add that 25%, that's a $12.5 million company, but this is 25% of the entire US, not just your little tiny market share. And if they're coming to you because they can't go anywhere else, that could be double, triple, quadruple what you're currently doing. But there's a downside to that too. And we're going to go back to that in a moment, but we're going to deviate a little bit to this question of, we talk about web accessibility for users, but what about employees? I've never heard this said. Can you please hold while I find someone sighted who can use the admin tool to reset your password? My question there is, have I never heard this because their internal tool is accessible, or because they don't hire blind people? So the Americans with Disability Act of 1990, we've heard, pretty much know about this, but I really wanted to walk you through this for just a moment because this has some interesting caveats. Okay, there's reasonable accommodation. Any change in the work environment or in the way things are usually done, processes, to help a person with a disability apply for a job, perform the duties of a job, and enjoy the benefits and privileges of employment. Enjoying the benefits and privileges of employment. Think about that for a second. Imagine if we had more people with disabilities as devs. I mean, we do make a fair amount of money, and we have pretty good health insurance coverage. And we have flexibility, depending on where you work, to sometimes work from home, or go to the kids' soccer thing, or go to the doctor's appointment you have twice a week. One in 3 people with disabilities do not have a usual healthcare provider. 1 in 3 adults with disabilities don't have enough health coverage. 1 in 4 don't even bother going to the doctor. Who could benefit more from the money, the health coverage, and the flexibility than people with disabilities. So back to reasonable accommodation. The law requires an employer to provide reasonable accommodation to an employee or job applicant with a disability, unless doing so would cause significant difficulty or expense to the employer. If it is too complicated and too expensive to make something accessible, they don't have to. Now, an employer may not refuse to provide an accommodation just because it involves some cost, but it's some cost. They don't have to provide the exact accommodation the employee or job applicant wants. If there's more than one option, it's up to the employer to choose. And you betcha they're choosing the cheaper one. Not the best one, the cheaper one. An employer does not have to provide accommodation if doing so would cause undue hardship to the employer. This may not necessarily apply to the really big box stores, but this applies to the smaller ones. This applies to us. I'm sorry, but the CMS is not accessible to someone with your disabilities. We can't hire you at this time. If your internal tools and processes are not accessible, you may be providing your employer legal protection against hiring people with disabilities. If people with disabilities cannot use your CMS, your admin tools, your customer service tools, your sales tools, and it's too expensive to make them so, or they can justify that it's too expensive to make them so, they don't have to, and therefore they won't hire people with those disabilities, which means the diversity in our teams may include gender, sexual orientation, race, but not abilities. So there's some resources as far as moving towards this accessibility thing that can help get you started. And some of these things are really relatively small. I'm not trying to browbeat you into it has to be perfect compliance, because there is no such thing. Some things contradict. Like someone with autism can't handle bright contrasty colors, but someone with color blindness has to have bright contrasty colors. You know, so sometimes those things contradict, and they can be a lot of work to try to get down into the nitty-gritties. So what I'm asking you to do is the best that you can. And I want to break this down into some smaller pieces. So first, here's some accessibility resources to help read up. And I'm not sending you to the really complicated, I don't understand what this reads after my 13th time through conversations. These are much smaller, bite-sized pieces that make sense. These are written by people that want to help you, not written by people that are trying to write a code of some sort. And you have Chrome, which means you have Lighthouse. And Lighthouse also has an accessibility score for both mobile apps and full-sized apps. You can check this today, and it does give you some information regarding what some problems are, how you may fix it, but it does tend to be a little bit more limited. So what I do recommend is the Axe, Chrome, and Firefox extensions. Axe is bigger and deeper than that. They have Axe Core, which is what Lighthouse uses. You can also take Axe Core itself and plug it into any of your testing suites to test for accessibility on the fly. You can do it in your unit testing, your end-to-end testing. And it gives you a starting point. The reason why I like Axe, though, is because of the fact that it gives you much more detailed information regarding why it's wrong and what you can do to fix it with multiple alternatives. Sometimes you can go for the quick, easy fix, but you don't have time to dig down into the deeper guts to fix it in a more thorough fashion. That's fine. Do what you can. So when we're looking at this, and I did use Solidus.io for my example here, 47 issues. And that's a lot of issues when you're just looking at the number. And I've seen some that are 135, 360, lots of issues, right? But don't let these numbers scare you. A lot of these are clustered, a lot of these are grouped. So I want to walk you through how we can start. What I want you to do is start with your definition of done. Start with you. I want you to decide today that no more code will go past you without at least a basic accessibility check. Use a button, not a div. Use a main tag where it's applicable. Use a nav tag where it's applicable. Don't use your headers as styling. Use them as ordered hierarchies. There's always code bases that exist. They're big, they're wonky. There's no such thing as a perfectly clean code base except for one that we just started today, and all we did was install the CLI and that was it. Everything after that, it gets to be messy. So trying to go again look at all the compliance we have to go for is too much. Look at all the stuff we have to do from all the past stuff. I don't even know how that stuff works. So just start today with your code, with your PRs that you review. I mean, we almost mindlessly go through those PRs and go, yeah, I'll do that, I'll do that, I'll do that, I'll do that. So if you say, can you convert this over to a button? They'll just go, yeah, sure, and do it. But every single one of those you fix is another person that can use your site, or another group of people that can use your site. Each fix matters and makes a difference. If you can't get to full compliance right now, that's great, as long as you're trying to move the needle. It is obviously best if we start from the very beginning, thinking about accessibility, thinking about what our colors are going to do when we put them on top of each other, thinking about how we're going to tab through our website, thinking about what the screen reader sees. But sometimes we don't have that luxury. So I think that answer of when should you start accessibility back at the beginning before you worked there is not really a good answer. I think the answer is today, with you. So after you've started, and maybe you've been the only one to buy into this, that's fine. Maybe you've got some team members to buy into this. Start by tackling your reusable components, because everywhere you fix a reusable component, you will fix everywhere it loads. So some of those issues that are like 22 problems will go down to 0 as soon as you fix that one div should be a button bug. Or the color contrast is too similar on the background and the foreground on that header. And then after that is going to be cleanup. You're going to be dealing with remaining issues, templates, one-off pages, the things that you had to deviate from the plan for a design issue. And after that, the real work begins. Because these tools only help you reach about 30 to 50% of compliance, legal compliance. What they don't check is whether the words you're using are too confusing, or whether the entire flow of the process is too complicated. But at least you can get these. And you can push back on the others. Listen, Jen, we did it, okay? We went on, handled all the accessibility issues. It's great, all's well, we had an audit, we fixed those things. We're done now, right? Great job. That's more than 90% of businesses out there have done. And I am so proud of you. But that doesn't change that doesn't change the composition of the people that work at your company. That allows for it to happen. But you have to make it a place that they feel like working. Diversity is when you count the people. Inclusion is when the people count. So some question that I heard and really liked at first was, do the people you work with feel like they belong? And that's a good question. Because there are those of us that are working at our jobs, but the environment isn't exactly conducive to being warm and welcoming. We don't feel like we're part of the team, we feel like we work at the place. So this is a good question to ask, but I want to go deeper. Who is missing from your team because they can't belong? And then I think you should go back and ask this. And then ask this again. And then ask this. And ask this again. This is a cycle. This is something that we can do for ourselves to try the best that we can as individuals and as teams to try to make sure that we aren't the problem. Because making it possible is not the same as making it available, making it welcoming, making it a place that people want to be. So I have a couple examples. Diversity. There is potentially one person of color in this photo. But because of the gentleman on the side, who's not on the stage because they didn't think about him when they decided to have this photo on the stage, they're diverse. And I look at this and it makes me angry because I feel like this is the lip service to diversity. Like we have the token woman from India, we have the token guy in a wheelchair. And we didn't even care enough about the guy in the wheelchair to make sure that when we did a team photo, he could actually be part of it. He has to be off to the side. This is inclusion. For everyone from people missing limbs to people with canes to people that don't have those types of physical disabilities are perfectly capable of being there. They all belong. They feel like they're meant to be there. You know, this is more diverse, yes. But the teacher is talking to every one of the students except for the woman in the very front row, pushed off to the side in the wheelchair. His body language almost shuts her out. And I brought this slide for multiple reasons. The very first time Barbie decided to do a doll in a wheelchair, her name was Becky. She did not last very long, like 6,000 sold in the first 2 days, 2 weeks. But Becky's dream house was not accessible. The wheelchair wouldn't fit through the doors. There was only stairwells. And the doll was discontinued relatively quickly. They brought him back again. But the point here is that inclusion doesn't start with Well, I'm going to be nice to someone in a wheelchair today. I'm going to be nice to someone with an invisible disability, with anxiety, or with autism, or any number of conditions. It starts young. It starts with teaching others as well. It starts with being the one to stand up and say, they belong here. If you don't like that, then you don't belong here. It starts with us teaching our children. It starts with that imaginative play where we include people from the very beginning. Did you notice that there's a woman with a prosthetic leg? Did you notice the shirt that says good vibes only that indicates an anxiety disorder? What other disabilities did you see? Accessibility, diversity, and inclusion is the responsibility of every one of us. We have the skills, the tools, and the power to make it happen. We can all be that advocate. We can all be the one to decide to make one change. We can all be the one to submit a PR that makes an example dev document more accessible. We can all push for color contrast. We can all look at things and say, you know, red and green are kind of an awful combo. How about red and blue? Blue and green are also an awful combo. How about blue and red? How about maybe more of a lime green and a magenta, if we're going to go with this green and red theme? What about making sure that we have underlines on links? Because if you have enough blindness that things are kind of fuzzy, or contrast isn't enough, the links can let you know where to click on something. Or making sure that we're using as close to semantic HTML as we can. I know it gets a little questionable once you start hitting things that aren't semantic HTML like tabs or accordions, but do the best you can. And those websites I gave you in the beginning will give you hints on how to make those even more accessible with things like ARIA roles. We have this beautiful opportunity to break open this industry to a whole new group of people. Smart, hardworking people that just want a chance, just like we did when we were first learning to code. Are you going to be the person that makes that possible? Or are you going to be the person that says, it's not really that important to us. We sell rainbows. Thank you.